I'm Meta Spencer. How would you like to go to Ottawa and meet a former diplomat, a retired distinguished Canadian who's represented his country in several countries and at the United Nations? Wouldn't that be fun? All right, let's go. Hi, Marius Grinius. Hello.
Hi, Meta Spencer. Great to see you, even though it's virtual.
Yeah, well, it's just almost as good. We can have a good chat. Okay, this is great. Now, I want to tell people who you are. You are now a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, but you've been around in your past. After a long and distinguished military career, you went into the Foreign Service, and you served, I believe, as Canadian ambassador to Korea. Actually, you went to North Korea and South Korea simultaneously, which is the neatest trick of the week. And you were also the ambassador and Canada's permanent representative to the United Nations and to the UN Conference on Disarmament in Geneva until 2011. Is that right?
2007 to 11. That's right.
A couple of months ago, I did a talk show with Bob Ray, who is now, he's your successor, not immediate successor, but he is now at the United Nations as the ambassador for Canada, right?
Just to correct that, Bob is in New York. I was at the UN in Geneva.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So he was more political, shall we say, in the context of the machinations there. Mm-hmm. And I would say Geneva is trying to, sort of hands-on, try to help, but equally political.
Well, I talked to him about human rights. And in fact, we had it organized such that I brought 3 people in who were especially concerned about a particular area of human rights. And we were really trying to find out what the ambassador could do, or what happens at the United Nations that might affect the well-being and protect the victims of human rights abuses. And my goodness, you've served in some hot spots in the world, but I guess you can't speak for Bob Ray, but maybe you can tell us about how things were for you.
First of all, with Bob Ray, whom I've met a couple of times when he was still a member of Parliament, and we talked about New York and Geneva in terms of the UN. There's an entire UN committee that's dedicated to human rights issues that works out of New York. But in Geneva, of course, there is the hopefully new and improved Human Rights Council that is supposed to take on a lot of the resolutions, the hands-on type of work that goes in, and I'll be able to explain a little bit as much as you wish. In terms of my own kind of experiences with respect to human rights, I have to start with my first posting in 1980, when I was first joined the Foreign Service and ended up in Thailand doing refugee work, and for almost it was about two and a half years. I've spent most of my time in refugee camps, dealing with the Indo-Chinese boat people, as they were called, out of Vietnam, but also the refugees out of Laos, Cambodia, and among them, of course, the hill tribe people, the Hmong, the Yao, and others, all being displaced because of political and military turmoil out of Indochina. So that was my first kind of, if you like, hands-on, let's do something in terms of human rights, and this is dealing with refugees.
Now, were you an ambassador to Vietnam too?
Later, I opened up our embassy in Hanoi in early 1990,
Mhm.
And then in '97 returned as ambassador. And again, human rights was front and center. It was rather interesting initially, particularly because there I was, new to Hanoi, but under instructions from Ottawa to raise a number of human rights issues of individuals, political detainees, a number of monks, Buddhist monks, but individuals. And so I did the needful to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam. But it was I still recall the Vietnamese desk officer for Canada, who, lovely lady, who really did not understand, but she was call her the Sherpa that made things happen,
Uh-huh.
and she was very interesting in the sense that she really wanted to know why Canada and other Western countries would put so much emphasis on individual rights, when from her Vietnamese cultural perspective, it was the importance, the primary importance of the community over any individual right. And of course, issues of a communist party ruling Vietnam, all for stability and no opposition. So we had some interesting discussions offline, and then this lady eventually got a scholarship to go to Harvard, and I lost track of her. Uh, and of course, dealt with her successors. But it was just always wondered if perhaps spending a bit of time in North America may have changed a little bit of her ideas. I'll never know, but it was an interesting discussion.
How do you encounter other people who made that into an issue?
Well, it's interesting because every country, I've had 5 postings to Asia, 2 to Thailand, 2 to Vietnam, and then to the Koreas, and every culture is quite different. It's from my perspective and experience, many of the Thai, for instance, were quite quiet. They would not necessarily argue too much uh, officially, but then you would get them uh, over a beer or something like that, and the kind of the attitude changed. With the Vietnamese, I found that they were very straightforward, and you could have um, call it a frank and fraternal exchange of views. We didn't necessarily agree, but it was quite different from, for instance, our Indonesian, Japanese friends who really just didn't want any upsetting of the general sort of situation, if you like. And of course the Koreans, for instance, much more like in my experience, much more direct, much more like the Vietnamese, for instance. So every culture, of course, plays a big thing. The Vietnamese saying, though, was, and this is almost more political than cultural, perhaps, but they would say that the nail that stands up above the others has to be hammered down, because again, ultimately, it's the community and the stability of the community that is so important.
I've had conversations with with a Japanese friend who she's Japanese Canadian, actually, I'll tell you her name because I know she wouldn't mind. It's Joy Kogawa. And she's always in trouble with the Japanese Canadian community for something like that. She really, wants to make sure that Japan, for example, accepts responsibility for the Nanking incident. I think it's an important question, and but maybe it's not diplomatically correct.
Diplomatic correctness has a place, but it's not the only place.
When you have a case of, you have to represent somebody who's being abused, and of course in the case of Canada right now, we have these two guys that China is holding. And then, of course, they would say, well, that you have our gal that you're holding. So, I mean, but when it comes to fighting for human rights, what are the possibilities?
It's a struggle. Let's put it that way. You have, of course, the establishment of the United Nations in 1945. You had the 3 years later, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. The predecessor of the Human Rights Council, the Commission, started to work back in 1946. So there has been certainly a progression of understanding people's rights, but that doesn't mean that everybody is going to have their own personal collective rights as the struggle continues. The Human Rights Council, just a little bit of background, you've got 47 members of that are there. They can serve for 3 years and then be reelected for another 3 years. They then have to take call it a sabbatical for a year before they can then run for another 3 + 3 years. And for me, right from the beginning, because I was there when the Human Rights Council started to work. Paul Meyer was the ambassador before me. He was Canada's representative for 1 year, and then I took over for the next 2 years. What I found truly interesting was the fact that there were some countries who are not great advocates of human rights, and I'm thinking of Russia, China, Cuba, who were there, did their 3 years, got reelected for 3 years, then were forced to take a year off, but they were back into the Human Rights Council. And I, of course, had to deal with those ambassadors, those representatives. You had the composition of the membership. You've got 13 from the African states, 13 from Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, 6.
They allocate by block.
By geographic block.
And they're elected by the General Assembly or what?
They are, yes, there is a vote back in New York, and any country has to get at least half of the membership of the 193 to be elected. But what has been happening is that clean slates have become a regular thing, i.e., if, for instance, the Asia Pacific group is retiring 3 members in a particular year, then there would only be 3 candidates for that position. it happens throughout the geographic sort of groupings. Latin America, 8, and the Western Europe plus others, which includes Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, also have 7 representatives. So every year, and it was staggered right from the beginning, certain countries would complete their term, and their successors would come in. But these days, rarely do they have to actually get elected because they're the only candidates. The same thing happens in the Security Council, by the way, these days. So,
really?
Oh yes, oh yes. Just as a sidebar, I was visiting from Geneva when 2 Security Council competitions ago. That would have been what, 2010, 9, whenever we lost subsequently.
Whenever Harper's
Yeah, during the Harper,
we blamed Harper, but of course, then Justin Trudeau also lost it next time, right? So
that is correct. But
yeah, okay.
But for instance, the Indian ambassador came up to me after we had lost, and he said, yeah, "Oh, I'm so sorry that Canada lost. We were really trying for you, but you guys have to figure it out a little bit better. India knows exactly when they will be on the Security Council." Because we've already done the deals, and there'll be nobody running. There'll be a number of countries running, but no more than the allocated geographic number. So what was ironic for the Human Rights Council, that the new members that were elected about last November for the 2021, 22, 23 interval, the China was running, but there were 4 other countries running. There were 5 countries. There was one competitor, which happened to be Saudi Arabia, because again, the geographics are not exactly what a geographer would call it, but Saudi Arabia lost.
Well, yeah, I was going to refer to that, and in fact, I didn't remember when it happened or who they were up against, but I remember hearing in the press discussion of the fact that Saudi Arabia was so obviously inappropriate for Saudi Arabia to even be on the council because they're such bad actors. And did they lose because of their own egregious misbehavior, or because some other bigger country wanted the seat?
Well, I have no idea. I don't have any insight into that. But for the last election, to start 2021, you had China, Nepal, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Uzbekistan as the 5 candidates for 4 seats. And guess what? Saudi Arabia didn't make it. Okay. But Western Europe, there were 2 vacancies coming up, and only 2 candidates, France and the United Kingdom. So again, I mean, it's not just one grouping. And by the way, what I find kind of funny, actually, is there is still the Eastern European grouping that includes Russia and the other Eastern European countries. But of course, most of the Eastern Europeans are now members of the EU and of NATO, and they will be like-minded with the rest of the Western group. And I always found it kind of amusing when my Russian counterpart was just unhappy that the good old Soviet Union days and ways were over. But again, a different story. China, Cuba, Russia, to a certain extent, because they did lose a vote once, have been the perennial, let's be in there, let's make sure we've got everything covered so that we will be elected. And of course, those three countries are the ones who will try to really fight any substantive move forward on pretty well any human rights area, and they would try to defeat strong resolutions that we would consider, or weaken others to just make sure that it doesn't kind of reflect back on them. Because again, there's another issue out there, of course, goes back to the United Nations Charter that talks about state sovereignty and also the non-interference in the internal affairs of another country. So when you when you look at how a particular human rights issue is being addressed, and hopefully with stronger resolutions, well, those countries, of course, will bring this up and make sure that issues get attenuated to a certain extent. So the struggle, it's trench warfare, at least in my time. Now, maybe since I left, everybody was happy, and and everybody now is living happily ever after. But I suspect not.
Well, in the conversation with Bob Ray, he used strong language. He said, "I'm swimming with sharks every day." So obviously, he says it's hard. It's hard. I'm not surprised.
No.
Actually, now I guess what I need is a better sense of what actually happens. Does somebody bring a charge against a country for some kind of violation, and it's debated there? It's not like a court. What do they consider? Give me some examples of cases that you had to deal with, and how you dealt with them, and what are the consequences. I mean, if a country goes there saying, well, we're on the council and we believe that you shouldn't interfere in the internal affairs of any other country. Therefore, if you bring up a case of torture or something like that, we will not, we don't care. I mean, they can get away with that, can't they? I mean, what's the story? How does this whole thing work?
Yeah, it's there are different elements in that. First of all, there is actually a complaints procedure that, say, for instance, a non-governmental organization in a tough situation in a nasty little country can actually bring it to the attention of the Human Rights Council, and you could move through it. There are, right now, as it has developed, the whole machinery of human rights, you've got something like 145 different human rights areas that people look at. And can be brought up to the attention of the Human Rights Council. But within that, you have special rapporteurs, for instance, and there are something like, for instance, 44 special rapporteurs on a thematic basis, and another currently 11 rapporteurs on different countries.
Okay, now
Everything.
wait a minute. These are like staff people, or are they the
No,
members of, these are the diplomats themselves that are
no.
appointed as, well, what?
They are human rights experts in a particular country or a particular theme, say torture or indigenous human rights or uh, health of the children. So again, I mean, I could go through the various themes that are out there because there
Okay,
are.
now here, I think I had little experience in that that may connect with that. I stayed in a B&B once in Geneva for a couple of weeks or more with a woman who had, she was representing, I don't remember, some South American country, Colombia, or, and I know another woman in Peru that are both delegates. They go to Geneva more than once, I think about 3 times a year, and make reports on the status of women.
Mhm.
Now, it's, I got the impression that every country has to submit a report, maybe with a checklist. If you say that there's a whole bunch of things that they report on, does every country have to go through and say, how are we doing on respect to this and this and this? And or what? Because I haven't heard of any Canadians going off to Geneva and making their frequent reports to any human rights council. I don't think I never heard of anybody talking about it. But it's
But
not that the only 2 people I know who've been going to report on the status of women have been Latin American women.
yeah, you're getting ahead of me, and you're getting into 2 different areas
Okay.
of, call it, endeavor. First of all, yes, the human rights of women is a thematic, um, a theme that has special rapporteurs who I think you've met, who would have a mandate for a certain number of years to look at rights of women. And they would travel to various parts of the world to look at this. There's another one, a special rapporteur on housing. There's another one on health. So they would, and again, as I mentioned, there's some 40 different themes that require a regular report to the Human Rights Council, and it gets submitted, it gets discussed, debated, and accepted. Or usually there are recommendations in terms of what else needs to be done. And as you know, human rights of women, as an example, or indigenous rights, or health, they're huge, huge requirements, let alone the more similar, but again, different reports on, for instance, on torture or extrajudicial killings. There's a whole bunch of things. But you touched on what is the big, I won't call it breakthrough, but an important step, an important innovation that really started with the Human Rights Council. And this is what is called the Universal Periodic Review. And it's now, what happens is that every country who is a member of the United Nations has to ultimately report, if you like, what they think is their human rights capacity, their human rights record, but it is then scrutinized by everybody else. And you would have a session where any country would then give its list of where country X can do better.
Hmm.
And then after, and the Human Rights Council Secretariat will record all of this. And by the way, it's all done live. So you can catch it at on the UN net. And so you would then have to report back the country X in terms of, first of all, accepting or not accepting recommendations. And if they do not accept, they will have to say why. And also come back later to say, well, this is what we have done. Now, this Universal Periodic Review started when I was there. It would have been 2007, 7 or 8. And
not to derail you, but I am curious because there was something called the Human Rights Commission, and it got turned into the Human Rights Council. Correct. And I don't know what the difference is, but you're apparently referring to a period of that transition, right? When you changed.
The transition started the creation, i.e., when the Human Rights Council was started in 2006, part of the new establishment, if you like, was this idea of the Universal Periodic Review, which hadn't been done under the UN Commission, the predecessor.
Okay.
And and the UN Commission, as far as I could, from what I've read, became less and less effective in terms of human rights. So finally, it became so embarrassing, I think, to people writ large, to non-governmental organizations, to the human rights fighters, if you like, that the countries were shamed into coming up with something a little bit better, which is the Human Rights Council, and certainly the Universal Periodic Review. And I was there for the first one. I forget who the senior Canadian, I think he was I think he was the Deputy Minister of Justice, who sat in the hot chair and listened and gave the Canadian, here's what we're doing. And unlike some countries, we were honest where we were failing in the context of Indigenous rights and the right to water, the right to health. There are a lot of aspects that we're hitting the Indigenous side, let alone other elements. And so we went through it, and now the entire system is into its third cycle. So after my time there, it obviously had gone through another Canadian scrutiny of Canada in terms of what they were doing right and what else had to be done. And now we're into third cycle. Just by the way, I was one of the vice presidents in my last year in the Human Rights Council, and we all took turns. My colleagues, the president was Nigerian. My two other vice president colleagues, one was from Jordan, and the other person was the Philippines. And we all took turns chairing these Universal Periodic Reviews. I had the privilege of chairing Cuba's. And what was really interesting was that they brought a number of Cuban NGOs to explain how wonderful the human rights situation was in Cuba. So my Cuban friend, who happens to be, in his own right, a human rights expert, but for the dark side, if you like. Nice guy, but he has had his orders. And anyway, so he really got upset. We almost came to blows. It's all probably recorded somewhere, because he had to show his minister what a great job he was doing. And but what happened was that I was allowing critics who were NGOs, who were also Cuban, but exiles, giving their side of the story. And I was quite meticulous and careful of giving enough time for everybody. But he got upset that I was giving anybody but the official NGOs time. Anyway, we survived that. We carried on.
Are the, if you will, the checklist, it probably isn't a checklist, but a list of criteria of points that you have to answer, how are you doing with water or indigenous rights or so on. Are all of these things derived from the UN Declaration of Human Rights, or did somebody make a new list separately? And how much agreement is there? Because if somebody like the Saudis or China are appointed to the Human Rights Council, and they simply don't accept the basic standards of what is considered a human right and what is not. I don't know. What do you do? So I guess that's the question. How much diversity of opinion is there about what is acceptable and what is not?
I guess the gold standard is the fact that there is a UN Charter and a UN Declaration of Human Rights. So it's all there: freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, all of that. The difficult part is then trying to convince particularly authoritarian states, communist states, fascist states, whatever kind of definitions you would like to put out in terms of who the bad guys are and what they do, and try to work better for for the human rights of their people. And it's an ongoing. That's what makes it such a tough slog in the trenches, if you like. To move the yardsticks in a way that most human rights advocates would like it. And one thing that was also difficult, and it's a kind of a sine wave, when I was there, it was Bush Jr. was president, and a couple of us Western types, Australia, Germany, Canada, were actually invited by the U.S. ambassador, a nice multimillionaire Texan at the time, to and told us that the Bush government was kind of being less and less active behind the scenes, because they were not a member of the Human Rights Council at that time, and they just informed us, and that was quite disappointing, because you need cheerleaders even when you're on the floor fighting for human rights. Then, of course,
excuse me, but if he was soft on the issue, I hate to think of what it was like under Trump.
Well, let me get there. The next thing, of course, was the election of Obama. And suddenly we had Samantha Power, one of his close, I think, friends, and ultimately ambassador to the UN. Samantha came to Geneva and talked to a number of us to get a sense of where and how the United States should play. And at that, and I think I certainly did, and I'm sure everybody else did, among the like-minded at least. I don't know if she talked to the Chinese or the Russian, but we said, hey, we need you. Please get back in to fight the good fight. And we actually then had in my case, my third ambassador counterpart, who was strictly focused on human rights. And she moved to Geneva, she lived there, and the United States suddenly became very active, and you could feel it. And certainly it continued during the Obama presidency. Then we had Trump, and Trump, thanks to him, I always call it a strategic retreat by the United States in terms of global issues and of course the rise of China's global ambitions, all of that kind of stuff. But Trump and the way he decided to play multilateralism, as you know, was a real setback in terms of what countries who are serious about human rights really want and hope for. So now, of course, we're waiting to see exactly how the Biden administration will work on it. And I think most people would be quite hopeful that Biden will become, and his administration will become much more active right across the multilateral sort of board, despite the fact that it's a real slog. And one of the issues I was going to mention, but I might as well mention it now, I find that there is a retreat of democracies in general, and a rise of authoritarian states that are strutting more these days. And certainly that makes the work within the Human Rights Council very, very challenging. And by the way, I finished Canada's 3-year term. Under Harper, I guess the decision was not to run for a second 3-year term. And Canada has not been a member of the Human Rights Council since 2009. Mm-hmm. Canada is supposed to be back, but it hasn't been back in terms of the real slogging that has to be done in the Human Rights Council.
Certainly, Canada got kind of a shock when Justin Trudeau wanted to be on the Security Council and was rejected. What was the issue that people were taking into account in making these judgments?
Personal opinion, as all of this has been, Canada, first of all, pretends to be a G7 player, and I believe in the context on the international side generally, it is fighting below its weight, its G7 weight. There are lots of, in terms of conversations, I know Asia better than what happens in Latin America and other places. But for instance, a lot of the Asian states say, yeah, hi, Canada, you're here for a little while, maybe a good time, but not all the time. And then we don't see you. There has been a regular pattern of inconsistent commitment to international affairs, however you wish to define them. When's the last time we've had a foreign policy review?
That's a good question. I don't actually remember.
Well, there was a so-called defense policy review that got delayed, but then it happened. And
That was about 4 years ago.
yeah, I put in, among others, of course, I had put in a paper basically saying you can't have a defense policy review unless you have a foreign policy review, because you need to set out the framework. So we had one speech by the foreign minister, Madam Freeland, who gave a masterful expose of all the problems out there, all the foreign policy challenges, but without saying what should be done about them. And that's it. So again,
excuse me, but would it be that defense policy positions, if not looked upon favorably, would affect the popularity of a country when it comes to human rights, being appointed to human rights? In other words, are these treated as separate domains, or do you feel that the general aura that a country acquires from all its good and bad deeds colors its reputation in every setting?
It's mostly, I think, the latter, and it's not to say that Canada is ignoring what's out there. We have troops under NATO deployed in Latvia. We have a renewed national defense commitment to help with sanctions against North Korea. There are things from a military point of view that they are doing. That Canada is doing. But again, the overall kind of aura, if you like, is Canada, G7 should be doing a heck of a lot more. And people remember the Monsieur Chrétien, for instance, when he hosted a G7 meeting, the big theme was support for our African friends. Mm-hmm. Well, the United Kingdom succeeded Canada, I think, and Blair also said, yeah, let's help our African friends. And then something happened, and suddenly I, in Geneva, had to start explaining to my African colleagues why we will be less active in a few of the UN organizations that are focused on Africa. Mm-hmm. My Cameroonian friend said, "Où est le Canada?" Mm-hmm. So it's a big thing. I obviously don't know how our political masters will do anything about it as there's COVID and a whole bunch of other things that are, and domestic policy.
But if I'm hearing you, that oftentimes the Canadian government will say, or somebody will say, we should just be paying more for military, because that's why they don't think much of us. We aren't paying a lot more for the military than we should. Is that number one, or is that just one of the package of issues?
I think it's probably, I think it's just one of a whole spectrum of issues. Canada has a feminist agenda. Okay. Great. What does that mean? What are we doing? I'm
glad you asked that, and not me.
Well, I'm trying to figure it out.
Really, I don't know. And
Well, I'm sure that there are um, people and individuals who are doing things, but I just don't know, and I try to keep up with what's happening in terms of Canada and internationally, and if I don't know, then you wonder how the Canadian public, or maybe they're not interested. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I don't think we ought to get sidetracked onto this too much, but honestly, I think it's the notion of a feminist foreign policy strikes me as kind of weird. Why is decent behavior considered more female than male?
Well, look at what's happening in Department of National Defense in terms of sexual harassment, and now we had Superior Court Judge Deschamps do a an entire review with recommendations. Nothing seems to have happened, and now we have Madame Louise Arbour, who's a wonderful lady who was the High Commissioner for Human Rights during my time, and so now she's going to do something more. But if you have that kind of issue within the military that is supposed uh, to be a champion of diversity and be a foe of harassment, sexual harassment, and what have you, we've got a problem.
Yeah, no, yeah, you're right. That particular issue is certainly real. I mean, I assume it has to be real. But as far as feminist foreign policy, I just it's strange, it seems to me, because what you want is a decent foreign policy that observes human rights of all kinds, and I don't see how that is a gender matter. But anyway, I'm being obstructionist here. I beg your pardon. It's not
You're a rabble rouser as always.
Well, I'm not very polite. That's true. That guy was right. Too American or something. Anyway, okay. Now, you say that Bob Ray, situated in New York, is in a different situation from you, because you were actually specializing in human rights there on that committee council, right? How is his work different from your role?
Well, I could only describe I can only describe what I did. Human rights was not the only thing. I was Canada's representative to the World Health Organization, the International Labour Organization, the Conference on Disarmament, the UN Commission on Refugees. These were all part of my bailiwick. Fortunately, we had a solid team on human rights. We also arms control. The Conference on Disarmament meant I had to, including eventually chairing the Conference on Disarmament. So that was yet another major focus of my work.
It must be very frustrating, because that's the place where nothing happens, right?
The Conference on Disarmament. I had fun. I got into trouble several times, but that's what doesn't kill you. Anyway, that was on the political PMO side. It was also exciting, because suddenly you're dealing with first of all the people. Antonio Guterres, now the Secretary General, he was the High Commissioner for Refugees. Worked with him regularly, trying to move. Geneva has been very much the doer, if you like. You had the political stuff happening at New York, the leaders coming to give the great speeches every autumn. Lots of things to do, especially with the Security Council, but not exclusively. But in Geneva, you had the kind of the bread and butter issues of development, I guess. You had the Organization for Disaster Relief was based in New York, but most of the work was done in Geneva, for instance. And then you had the World Food Program, for instance, that was based in Rome, but most of how to get food to refugees or displaced people had to happen through Geneva. So a heck of a lot going on when you have health, refugees,
Sounds like
labor.
you had kind of more logistical tasks, handling all of those different issues.
You can call it logistics. The military has a term that basically says without insulting Bob Ray, but the military would say that amateurs talk strategy, the professionals talk logistics, and there's a certain amount of truth, I think, to that in terms of just the mechanisms that are found in Geneva and in New York. I mean, they're complementary, and I think they work very, very well. But again, to a somewhat different focus.
Well, now, and when I talked to Bob Ray, I didn't ask him whether anybody had actually brought a case, so to speak, or an allegation or some sort of charge against, say, China for the Uyghurs and Myanmar for the. Well, I know that there's a case in the Hague about the situation of the Rohingya. Would this sort of thing be functioning now? Would there actually be right now some review of what's going on, what the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang, and so on?
I would think that given the talk of genocide, that it would be front and center in terms of discussions that would happen probably first in the corridors. A lot of work gets done in the corridors before it ever gets to any sort of official public area. And so it would be part of the ongoing conversation. Most countries are kind of neutral; they'll go along, and some countries do not even. Some ambassadors, I got the impression, didn't even have instructions from their capitals. It was just how they thought things should go. But then you have the obstructionists that are there, and you have to try to be smarter than them. But many of these, even individuals, are experts in their area and are formidable opponents.
I've learned a lot. Appreciate
it. And I enjoyed it. Thank you. It's you made me work.
Okay, that's okay. I think we're both doing okay about work, right? Good for you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Take care, Marius. Bye.